May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
John 3:16 and 17. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. We know these verses well. If you're watching any major sporting event on television or in person, you're likely to see this verse plastered on a poster board or printed on a t-shirt. These verses have a lot about God packed into them. It tells us of a God that loves so radically that God would sacrifice God's only Son to be subjected to the brutality of this world, subjected to rejection. It tells of the gift that God offers the world, something of a future beyond our imaginings of this life, the gift of eternal life, the gift of salvation. What comes next tells us about what role we play in this process. This 16th and 17th verse in the 3rd chapter of John is then met with what follows in the rest of this gospel passage proclaimed today as our response to that radical love. A love, again, so radical that one might find it hard to believe. Perhaps we imagine whether or not we would be able to sacrifice a child for the sake of others. But what we have to acknowledge first is that that is an incomplete analogy. It falls short because we know that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. God and Jesus, one. One might interpret this as God choosing to love in this way. But 1 John 4 tells us that God is love. It is less of a choice God makes than it is God just being God. Love being love, doing love. So then, this sacrifice God offers us is a self-offering, an outpouring of God, of love manifested in this world. Our idea of love falls short of this, but our belief is rooted in that radical love. Our response to this love is the choice that we have to believe or not to believe. It's easy to say either or here. Either you believe or you don't. But I can't help but think of this concept of belief in light of the transformation that Christina spoke about in her sermon yesterday. A transformation that takes place when we lift our gaze and set it on Jesus. A transformation that moves one from the darkness and into the light as Nicodemus was moved. Remember, he came to Jesus in the night, the darkness of the evening, providing a safe space for him to come to Jesus and explore curiosity. This initial movement eventually led him to be one of the persons to care for Jesus' bloody and bruised body as he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb. Jesus speaks of judgment in this passage. He says, "And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil." The Greek term used here for judgment is crisis. It does not refer to one moment of judgment, but rather a continual process of evaluating one's own behaviors, one's own actions, and determining whether they are directed toward light or darkness, toward liberation or oppression, toward life or death. I want to interrogate this binary of light and darkness, though. We often think about darkness as being a scary, ominous thing. Did God not make both night and day? Did God not create everything, both darkness and light? Darkness is both necessary and inevitable. An infant is formed in the darkness of a mother's womb, in a safe, nourishing environment where every intricate system and organ develops. And when the tiny body is ready to emerge from this safe place, the infant must live in a new way, to be and to exist in a new reality. From the darkness, a new light is birthed. To believe is our choice. It is also an action. To believe is to behave and move through this life in a particular way, a way of love, and it is not always easy. But if our actions begin as the gospel began, for God so loved, if our actions begin and are rooted in the love of God, then we are directed toward life. To believe is to engage in the process of asking oneself, is this the darkness that precedes new life? God is not on trial in this passage. This passage calls us into deep self-reflection. God's love, God's gift of salvation is constant. We are the variables in the equation. God does not prevent us from choosing to engage in deeds that are not motivated by love. We choose to live either in the darkness or constantly striving towards the light. The judgment John speaks about is the judgment that we bring upon ourselves in the way that we live, the way that we respond to God's radical love. Will we accept it? Will we choose to look towards life, liberation, and love? This choice to live in the light and to resist remaining in darkness speaks to our greatest potential. The potential to receive the revelation of God to us in Jesus Christ and to embody that goodness, to be revelations of God's love in the world. This is the way. This is the light of the world, love. It is a call to self-reflection, a call to take inventory of our daily choices. This is a life of belief lived out, and it is free for the whole world to partake in. John shares this hope that is given to the whole world, even those who have not yet believed, but that are still in the darkness, perhaps, being birthed into new light. The choice is always there. Salvation is ours. We need only lift up our faces to the Lord, reach out our hands to accept the gift of God's grace, and believe. As we go about our day, I leave you with a few questions to ponder. How do the choices that we make from day to day reflect our belief in the God who so loves this world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may perish but may have eternal life? What are our choices communicating to others, to ourselves? Is it communicating gratitude, praise, honor? Where in our lives might there be a need for God's light to transform us? And remember that God's love surrounds us always, and that there is never a moment, even as we are emerging from moments of despair and grief, that God is not with us, encouraging and loving us towards the fullness of life that he so desires for us. And God steps with us from darkness to light, through the darkness into life. Amen.
Amen.